Thank you, Mayor. Everyone will have an opportunity to ask questions later at the open forum. In the meantime, let's call on our next speaker. Dr. Solidum has been with the Phivolcs since 1984, the agency tasked to mitigate the effects of earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanic eruptions. In 2010, the doctor received the Presidential Lingkod Bayan Award for raising the bar of disaster risk reduction and initiating a nationwide mapping campaign for the Philippines. He's a recognized expert in geochemistry, marine geology, volcano and earthquake geology, geologic hazards assessment and awareness, and earth science education. Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Dr. Renato Solidum Jr., Director of the Philippine Institute for Volcanology and Seismology.
Thank you, Patricia. People wonder why, despite the advancement in science and technology, and despite our experiences in many disasters, we are still affected by disasters. My talk today would focus on disaster imagination. I think the reason why we are so much affected is because at all levels of society, we don't have the same imagination of what can happen to us, such that our preparedness, our mitigation, our response, and faster recovery are not in sync and slow. Disaster imagination is a very important thing that we must all know. The reality is the Philippines is blessed with many hazards. We're prone to typhoons, floods, storm surges, and geological hazards like earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions. As Filipinos, we cannot avoid the hazards. We are prone to hazards, but we should prepare and mitigate so that we are not considered a disaster-prone country. For example, in 2012, Mindanao was crossed over by Typhoon Pablo, and thousands of people died. Here in this region, November of 2013, Super Typhoon Yolanda came with strong winds and very high levels of sea storm surges that killed more than 6,000 people and devastated not only the region, but also many other regions in the Philippines. Prior to this, a magnitude 7.2 earthquake affected Bohol Island in central Visayas, killing 220 people, devastating lifelines like water supply, power, communication, and even road systems. If we look back at many of these disasters, we can learn so many lessons. One would be that we should monitor and provide appropriate warning to local officials and the public. It is not enough to provide warning to public, but we need to pinpoint the local officials which have the highest level of active participation to mobilize people to evacuate to safer grounds. We need to communicate clearly the hazards and, most importantly, the impacts that might happen to the communities, to the provinces, and to the whole region. We must respond properly before the disaster and, of course, obviously after. Please note that our disaster preparedness should not focus only on saving lives, making sure that critical lifelines like power, water, transport systems, and communication lines are not much affected or can be built back right away. To do this, we need to simulate the different hazards and the impacts that might happen to an area. However, despite saving lives, our properties, our businesses will still affect how we recover back after a major disaster. So we really need to make sure that mitigation measures are implemented. Implementation of the building code and land use plans are very important to minimize loss of lives and loss of properties. Whether we prepare or whether we mitigate, there will still be effects. There will still be people that might be injured, that might need help, such that during extreme events, we need to have as many disaster responders and medical responders. All of these must be done, but let us focus first on the very essence of preparedness, mitigation, and response, and that is trying to imagine what can happen to an area, not only the hazards and its effects. The question now that we must ask ourselves is that we all know that our provinces, our regions will be affected by disasters. So how do we reduce the risks or the potential losses, loss of lives, properties, and businesses, and even our economy from extreme natural events like earthquakes, tsunamis, typhoons, and many other associated hazards. Let me now talk about disaster imagination. One of the famous scientists in the world is Albert Einstein. I think you all know him. Albert Einstein said that imagination is more important than knowledge. Given the facts that we will all give to you, unless you tie these facts all together and think of how you can improve things, think of how you can invent something, the facts and knowledge will be useless. One time, Albert Einstein was invited to talk, and he was so famous then, but there was no TV during his period. He got so tired of delivering his lecture, and he asked his driver to deliver the lecture for him. The driver said, "Sir, how about if they ask me a very hard question?" Albert Einstein imagined an answer, and he told the driver. So indeed, the driver, posing as Albert Einstein, delivered the lecture for him, and he was given a standing ovation after the lecture. The first question came, and it was very difficult. But Albert Einstein, also known as the driver, told the questioner, "Sir, your question is so easy that even my driver, pointing to Albert Einstein, can answer it." That's imagination. But what is really disaster imagination? Disaster imagination consists of the following steps. I have prepared a diagram to really relate the different phases of disaster management and linking disaster imagination to what we do here in the Philippines. We respond, we prepare, we mitigate, we respond, and we recover. But how do we tie this up to the disaster imagination thing that I am proposing? The very first step that we must do is identify the hazards that will affect your place and beyond. The reason why we are caught unprepared is sometimes we think only of our locality, and we don't think of the effect of the hazard from the other localities that will help us in case there is a major disaster. Second, we stop only in assessing the hazard, but we don't assess the risk. We don't want to count the potential number of death, number of injury, how many houses will be lost. That is risk assessment. Whether there will be bridges, airports, power, water, will there be communication after a disaster? Please note that we should not stop from hazards and hazards assessment only. We need to do risk assessment. So when we do hazards and risk assessment, we propose early warning and preparedness measures. That is to save lives. We propose to mitigate by building engineering intervention or non-engineering intervention to mitigate the effects on properties and our businesses. Even if we do prepare and mitigate, during extreme events like Yolanda or big earthquake or tsunami, there will still be damages that will be brought about by these events. So we need to focus on critical facilities that are so vital to us, like hospitals, bridges, lifelines, and for example, the airport. We need to imagine the damages to these facilities so that if we anticipate that there will be damages, we can procure parts or equipment, prepare human resources, so that whenever that damage has happened, we can recover back and operate the critical facilities right away. To do this, we also need to look at how we will solve the different problems to propose appropriate actions. So in essence, disaster imagination is having many steps in advance prior to the event of a disaster. Critical to the operation of local governments and vital facilities is the concept of recovery time objective. It is essentially a deadline set that when there is a disaster, at a certain number of hours or days, a critical facility will be operated back. I heard that the Department of Transportation and Communication said that if another major disaster visits Tacloban, they wanted to make sure that the runway can be operated after 24 hours of the disaster. And that is the recovery time objective. If we don't have a deadline to recover operation at the local government, for companies and the national government, we will only respond when able, and that will be very slow. And people will think we are not responding properly and we are slow in response. To operationalize the disaster imagination and actions that we must do, I have subdivided an end-to-end warning system activities that we must all do whether we're in government or in private. First, you should know the hazards and risks in your area. Second, you need to monitor the hazards and risks. The national agencies can monitor the typhoon, but you should monitor the monitoring agency of government so that you would know what's happening. Third, this information and warning must be disseminated. National agencies bring it down. You, our partners, and the local government should bring this further down to the people. All of these three, know hazards and risks, monitor, warn, and disseminate information, are critical and mostly done by those at the higher level of society. That is the government and media partners and other organizations. But the fourth and very important part of an early response to the disaster is actually the role of all of us as individual, family, and the local government. That is, despite all the advances in warning in the information shared, if we don't do a proper and timely response, there will still be a disaster. So we need to respond properly and timely. Let me expound on these topics one by one. First is to know the hazards and risks in your area. What is the hazard? This can be based on history and science-based scenarios. Second, know the areas to be affected. Will your town be affected? Will your neighboring town be affected? Will the whole province be affected? Will the whole region be affected? Because it will matter. Response will come from those not affected areas, and it might come from a further distance. It is also important to know this so that proper response will be coordinated right away. We need to build scenarios so that those who will not be affected can preposition their help before the arrival of a possible event. What will be affected is very important, aside from who will be affected. Which houses will be destroyed? Which buildings, properties will be affected? Which bridges, telephone lines, or power lines, or water supply will be affected? All of this can be answered by information coming from mandated organizations, which are the main providers of hazard maps, and partner organizations that will now share this with you, for example, Rappler. For your information, any hazard map for earthquake, tsunami, and volcanic eruptions only come from Phivolcs. We are the mandated organization. The other hazards like floods, storm surges, rain-induced landslides come from PAGASA, Mines and Geoscience Bureau, and Project NOVA of the OST. Let me share you an example of how we should imagine things here in Region 8. All of you know that there's a potential problem for typhoons and storm surges. But let me remind you of earthquake problems and tsunami problems in this region. Shown on the map would be the earthquakes all over Eastern Visayas. Where the concentration of earthquakes are where the earthquake generators are. Historically, you all know that in October of 1897, a super typhoon passed over the same island of Leyte and generated storm surges that killed thousands in Palo and now the present Tacloban. That is October of 1897. But in the same month, a major earthquake of a magnitude 7 or greater affected the region, such that in one description in Lauang, Samar, it said that all the public edifices, churches, rectory, schools, and court, which were spared by the typhoon, have been damaged by the earthquake. Ibig sabihin, yung natira ng typhoon na mga building ay nasira during the earthquake. So please note that you should not prepare only for one hazard. You should prepare for multiple hazards. Don't forget the geological hazards when you rebuild back Eastern Visayas. The scenario is, if there is a major earthquake coming from the Philippine Fault Zone in Leyte, magnitude 7.2 earthquake can shake the whole island of Leyte with an intensity of 8. Intensity 8 is a very destructive ground shaking. That is the red color. And to imagine an intensity 8 ground shaking, I show a video clip of the Japan earthquake of 1995. You would note that these two persons were standing, they stopped transacting, and then they felt the earthquake. Please note that this building did not collapse, but all things were moving such that you are not able to stand during a strong earthquake at intensity 8. So what are you supposed to do when there is an earthquake after I talk? You should do what? If there's a table or none, drop, cover, and hold. Drop, cover, and hold. And if there is a table, and if you don't like the term drop, cover, and hold, you should remember this very important phrase. Do an under-the-table activity. The only under-the-table activity allowed, and that is during the earthquake. Joke lang yan. Another scenario, if a magnitude 8.2 earthquake occurs from the Philippine Trench, tsunamis will be generated. And this map would show you that at least 5 meters high to 9 meter high waves can affect eastern Visayas. Theoretically, if a storm surge or a tsunami is indicated as a certain height, for example, 5 meters, theoretically, the 5-meter elevation can be reached unless there are many barriers. So you see, you can really imagine the extent of the hazard by looking at the topographic maps or the topography of the land. To help you in determining the possible simulated scenarios, we have a software that we have prepared and being shared with the local government. That is a software that can do hazards assessment, that you can put all your exposure data, and also a software that can be used to determine how many will die, how many will get injured, and also the number of buildings that will suffer damages. Last, after the simulation, you should disseminate the information and share this to all the possible stakeholders. So if Pag-asa, for example, is telling you about a typhoon, or Phivolcs is talking about a tsunami, so what would be the hazards involved? Second, where is the current location of the typhoon or tsunami, and where will it impact? What will be the effect? And more importantly, what is the scale or intensity of the hazard? Ano po ba ang kategory ng typhoon o gaano kataas ang tsunami? In the Philippines, tsunamis are very important, and we have devised an information tool. The reason why I am showing this as an example is that don't study the warning system when there is already a warning. You should study it prior to the use of the warning system. So if we have a tsunami warning, it would mean that 1 meter or more waves will happen and you need to evacuate low-lying areas. But technically though, there are many other things that you can use to monitor a possible disaster. For example, you can use natural observations for warning a possible event like a tsunami. So in a tsunami, you can use 3 signs for warning. The first is shaking, or the word shake, you remember. The sudden retreat of seawater, or drop. And then the roaring sound when the tsunami is arriving. So just remember these 3 simple words. Shake, drop, and roar. Ulit, shake, drop, and roar. Hindi po shake, rattle, and roll. Sini lang po yun. Knowing the technical warning and knowing the natural observations, now we can respond to these events properly. And to respond to it, it was already shared by Mayor Javier, but let me just emphasize that there are 3 phases of responding properly. Prior to the event, you need to prepare. You need to have evacuation procedures, identified evacuation sites. You need to evaluate the site safety and location safety, implement the building code and proper land use. And this is very importantly done by the local government. During the warning, you need to monitor the monitoring agency that would give the information, and then you follow the recommended actions. For example, evacuation, or for fishermen not to go out to the sea. And lastly, after the event, we need to now assess the effects. We need to share these observations to the proper authorities. We need to assess the needs of the people so that we can recover and respond faster. And here lies, in many of these aspects, social media can help, especially in assessing the effects and assessing the needs, as shown earlier by prior speakers. let me just emphasize some of the things that the local government must do. These are pictures of typhoon effects in Mindanao. The lower left is the Orchid subdivision in Iligan City, which is along the meander of river. Dapat hindi yan nilalagyan ng subdivision. And why did that happen? Improper land use. During Typhoon Pablo in Davao Oriental, many buildings collapsed simply by the strength of the strong wind. We need to upgrade our building code for wind, and we need to follow. It's not simply saving lives by evacuating, but making sure that our houses are safe. And so, to help you in really assessing if your house, built up of 1 to 2-story concrete hollow blocks, are safe from an earthquake, we have prepared a 12-point questionnaire, how safe is my house, so that you can check your house for earthquake safety. Every question is answered by 1 or 0 score, and at the end of the questionnaire, you can tell if your house is safe or not from an earthquake. If you have so many houses, but you're worried about your wife and your children, you can rename the title of How Safe is My House to How Safe is My Wife. I think now you will be more serious about it. Please use this. Rappler has posted this in their website as well. Preparedness at the coastal communities. You must have an evacuation plan for storm surges and tsunami. And please note that if you are rebuilding back better for Yolanda, did you consider the tsunami hazard, which is further inland when it comes to the reach of the water? We need to prepare evacuation map, put up signage, and conduct drills. So in summary, let me end by making sure that you remember at least some of the things that I have mentioned. We cannot do anything with the hazards. Our country is exposed to extreme natural events, whether it's related, typhoons, earthquakes, or tsunami. But preparedness, mitigation, and response measures will only be based if we have an appropriate hazard and impact scenario. And that is disaster imagination. And disaster imagination is needed so that appropriate solutions are given. If you have a sickness, the doctor will not treat you until he has the proper diagnosis. So we need to know the problem to give the proper solution. Ladies and gentlemen, in this room, we have many things to share. We have maps, information, and technical solutions to impart. I think these are already available, and let's use it. But the most important thing is that we cannot do it singly or by ourselves one by one. We must collectively work together to make sure that our communities are safer and resilient to disaster. Hindi pa pwedeng iba ang disaster imagination ng isa, iba ang disaster imagination ng isang mayor, iba si governor, at iba ang national leader. Pag iba-iba ang imagination, hindi tayo magkakaroon ng tamang paghahanda at tamang pagre-responde. If you want to get maps, warning for earthquake and tsunami, and any other information related to our products, please follow us on website and our social network. Please remember, ano po ang mantra sa government? Sumunod sa matuwid na daan. But in our social networking mantra, sinasabi ko po, sumunod na po kayo sa matuwid na daan. Marami pong salamat sa inyong lahat.
Thank you, sir.